What could bring the king of rock and roll, a man who commanded stadiums and made millions scream, to tears? Elvis Presley, who'd sung about heartbreak 1,000 times, who'd lived through fame's highest highs and lowest lows, heard something that night that shattered him completely. The song played only once. He never spoke its name in public again. But what happened in those 3 minutes changed everything he thought he knew about music, loss, and the unbearable weight of memory. This is the story of that haunting night, and the mystery that still lingers in the shadows of Graceland. Drop your theory in the comments. What kind of song could break Elvis? Memphis, 1977. The air hung thick and heavy that January evening, pressing against the windows of Graceland like an unwelcome visitor. Inside the music room, Elvis Presley sat in his favorite leather chair, the one positioned perfectly between the grand piano and the stereo system that had cost more than most people's homes. He wasn't the same man who'd gyrated across the Ed Sullivan Show decades earlier. Time and circumstance had carved deep lines into his face, but his eyes, those legendary eyes, still held their penetrating intensity. Jerry Schilling, one of the Memphis Mafia's most trusted members, had arrived with something unusual, a plain brown package, no return address, postmarked from somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. Inside was a single reel-to-reel tape and a handwritten note on yellowed paper. The writing was shaky, ancient-looking, as if penned by someone whose hands had long forgotten steadiness. "You need to hear this alone," the note read. "She made me promise." Elvis turned the paper over in his hands, studying it under the lamplight. "She? She who?" he muttered, but Jerry could only shrug. The package had been delivered to his office, not Graceland. An odd choice that suggested someone who knew the inner workings of Elvis's world but wanted to maintain distance. Against his better judgment, Elvis threaded the tape onto his professional recorder. The equipment was state-of-the-art, the same setup he used for rehearsals and private recordings. As his fingers hovered over the play button, something made him pause. Call it intuition. Call it premonition. Elvis had learned long ago to trust the feeling when something significant was about to happen. "You sure you want to do this, boss?" Jerry asked, noting the unusual hesitation in Elvis's movements. "I've heard everything, Jerry. Every kind of song there is." Elvis's voice carried that familiar confidence, but there was something else underneath. A tremor of uncertainty he rarely showed. "What's one more?" He pressed play. The first sounds were barely audible, the crackle of old recording equipment, the shuffle of movement, then the clearing of a throat. A woman's voice emerged from the speakers, unaccompanied, raw, and immediately arresting. It wasn't professionally recorded. This was someone singing in their living room, or perhaps at a kitchen table, with a single microphone capturing every breath, every slight waver of emotion. But it was the words that began to work their way into Elvis's consciousness like cold water seeping through stone. The song spoke of loss, yes, but not the romantic kind he'd sung about countless times. This was different. This was about a specific kind of grief, the kind that came from choices made and roads not taken. It spoke of a child, of sacrifice, of a secret kept through decades of silence. Elvis's posture changed within the first 30 seconds. His shoulders, which had been relaxed, tensed, like a man preparing for impact. Jerry watched as his boss's hands gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening. The woman's voice continued, each line more devastating than the last, building toward something that felt inevitable and unbearable all at once. And Elvis, the man who'd made the world cry with his voice, began to understand why this tape had found its way to him. The voice on the tape belonged to someone old. That much was clear from the slight rasp that colored certain notes, the way breath support faltered on longer phrases. But the emotion was timeless, raw as an open wound. Whoever this woman was, she was singing her truth, perhaps for the first and only time. Elvis sat frozen as the second verse unfolded, his face draining of color. Jerry had seen his boss in countless situations, triumph, exhaustion, anger, joy, but never quite like this. The king looked small somehow, diminished, as if the music was pulling something vital from him with each passing second. The lyrics painted a picture of a young woman in the 1930s, poor, desperate, faced with an impossible choice. She sang of holding her baby just once, memorizing the shape of tiny fingers, the weight of a small body against her chest. She sang of an orphanage with iron gates, of walking away as her child cried, of the sound that would haunt every dream for the next 40 years. "Turn it off," Elvis whispered suddenly, his voice cracking. Jerry moved toward the recorder, but Elvis held up a hand, stopping him. "No, wait. I need to hear this." The woman's voice grew stronger in the third verse, almost defiant now. She sang about watching from afar, about secret visits where she'd stand outside schoolyards, about birthday cards sent anonymously, about following a career from the shadows. She sang about pride and agony existing in the same breath, about loving someone who would never know your name. That's when Elvis made a sound. Not quite a sob, but close. His hand came up to cover his mouth, and his eyes, those famous eyes that had seduced a nation, brimmed with tears that caught the lamplight. Jerry felt his own throat tighten. He'd been with Elvis through the death of his mother, through the dissolution of his marriage, through countless personal crises. But this was different. This was something primal, something that cut straight through all the layers of fame and persona to the vulnerable core beneath. The bridge of the song shifted to a more intimate tone, almost conversational. The woman sang about regrets, about wondering if she'd made the right choice, about hoping her child had found happiness and love and success. She sang about a newspaper clipping kept in a Bible, about watching from the back of the audience, about the unbearable pride and equally unbearable pain of anonymity. And then came the line that broke him completely. The woman sang about a boy with music in his soul, about a gift she'd recognized even in infancy, about praying that whoever raised him would nurture that gift. She sang about Mississippi, about a town called Tupelo, about letting go so that love might flourish elsewhere. Elvis's tears fell freely now, silent but unstoppable. His whole body shook with the weight of understanding, with the devastating possibility that this voice from the past might be telling him something about his own story that he'd never known. The tape continued, merciless and tender all at once. Jerry stood paralyzed, watching his friend unravel. Elvis never cried. Not like this. Sure, he'd shed tears at his mother's funeral, had gotten emotional during certain gospel songs, but this was something else entirely. This was a man confronting the possibility that his entire life story might have been incomplete. The song entered its fourth verse, and the details became more specific, more impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. The woman sang about a twin, about one child kept and one given away, about poverty so crushing it forced a mother's hand. She sang about hoping the family who took her boy would give him the life she never could. Elvis's mind raced backward through his childhood memories. His twin brother Jesse, stillborn, buried in an unmarked grave. His mother Gladys, who'd clung to him with an intensity that sometimes felt desperate. His father Vernon, whose eyes sometimes held secrets that were never spoken aloud. What if there was more to the story than he had ever been told? "This can't be real," Elvis muttered, but his voice held no conviction. In the music industry, he'd learned to detect authenticity, to separate genuine emotion from performance. This woman wasn't performing. She was confessing, bearing witness to her own history, with the kind of raw honesty that couldn't be faked. The song described watching a young man with a guitar, with jet black hair and a voice that could make the world stop spinning. It spoke of knowing, just knowing, that this was her child, grown beyond her wildest dreams, but forever beyond her reach. She sang about the torture of proximity, of seeing him on television, of hearing his voice on the radio, of dying a little with each reminder of what she'd surrendered. Jerry found his voice. "Boss, maybe we should call someone, your daddy or—" "No." Elvis's response was sharp, immediate. "Not yet. I need to hear all of it." The woman's voice grew weaker now, the age more apparent. This recording, Elvis realized, had been made recently, perhaps in the last few months. There was an urgency to it, the sense of someone racing against time to tell a truth before it died with them. She sang about forgiveness, not asking for it, because how could she? But needing to speak it aloud, to send it into the universe on the chance that somehow, someday, it might reach the ears it was meant for. She sang about understanding that she'd given him away out of love, not abandonment, though the distinction might mean nothing to the child who grew up not knowing. And then, in a moment that felt suspended between reality and dream, she spoke his name. Not sang it, spoke it. "Elvis," the voice said simply, tenderly, breaking the song's rhythm. "My beautiful boy, I hope you had a good life. I hope someone loved you the way I wanted to. I hope the music brought you joy." The tape hissed into silence. Elvis sat motionless, tears streaming down his face, staring at the recorder as if it might offer more answers. But there was nothing left except the mechanical sound of the empty reel spinning. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic activity conducted in absolute secrecy. Elvis demanded answers, but he demanded them quietly. Jerry was dispatched on mysterious errands, calls to lawyers, inquiries to county records offices in Mississippi, discreet conversations with elderly relatives who might remember things that had never been discussed openly. Vernon Presley arrived at Graceland on the second evening, summoned by a message that said only, "We need to talk about 1935. The old man's face went pale when Elvis played him the tape. He listened in silence, his weathered hands trembling slightly, and when it ended, he sat for a long moment before speaking. "Your mama made me promise," Vernon said finally, his voice heavy with decades of secret-keeping. "Made me swear on Jesse's grave that we'd never tell you. She said it would only hurt you, knowing there was someone out there who'd given you up." The story came out slowly, painfully. Gladys Presley hadn't given birth to twins that January morning. She'd given birth to a single son. But there had been another baby, born weeks earlier to a young woman who'd come to Vernon through a mutual acquaintance. The woman was destitute, unmarried, facing the kind of social condemnation that could destroy a life in 1930s Mississippi. She'd agreed to give up her child to a couple who desperately wanted one, who'd recently lost their own baby. The arrangement was informal, unrecorded, the kind of adoption that happened in back rooms and was sealed with handshakes rather than legal documents. Gladys and Vernon took the baby boy, claimed him as their own twin, and created the story of Jesse's death to explain why only one child survived. The biological mother had promised to disappear, to never make contact, to let her son have a normal life. "But she couldn't stay away completely," Elvis said, understanding dawning. "She watched me, followed my career." Vernon nodded miserably. "Your mama suspected as much. Sometimes she'd see a woman at the edge of crowds when you performed locally. Always the same woman, always keeping distance. It ate at Gladys, worried her sick." The revelation recontextualized everything: his mother's possessive love, his own lifelong sense of incompleteness, the depression that had shadowed him despite his success. He wasn't a surviving twin mourning a lost brother. He was an adopted child who'd never known it, raised by a woman who'd loved him fiercely but carried the weight of deception. "Where is she?" Elvis asked quietly. "The woman on the tape." Vernon's face crumpled. "Jerry's people tracked down the address from the postmark. I'm sorry, son. She died 3 weeks ago. Lung cancer." The tape was her final act, something she recorded and arranged to have sent after her death. Elvis closed his eyes, feeling the loss of someone he'd never known but who'd shaped his existence from the shadows. A mother who'd loved him enough to let him go, and who'd suffered in silence while he became the biggest star in the world. He would never hear her voice except on that tape, never get to say thank you, or ask why, or offer forgiveness. The mystery was solved, but the ache remained. Elvis never spoke publicly about the tape or what it revealed. He kept it locked in a safe at Graceland, listening to it alone during the darkest hours of the night. Those close to him noticed a change, a deeper melancholy, but also a strange peace, as if a lifelong question had finally been answered. The song remains a secret, known only to a handful of people who've sworn never to reveal its title. But the story reminds us that behind every legend is a human being, carrying mysteries and sorrows we can never fully understand. What do you think Elvis did with this knowledge in his final months? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow for more untold stories of music's greatest legends.